Hello and welcome to another episode of A Single Window. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about that concept that we sort of alluded to in the last video, which is a priori. So I'm not going to use it really in the exclusive philosophical tone if you've heard it before. Like we said before, a priori just means something before. And this cause-effect relationship thing will play into it somewhat later. If we were to think of this related to our diagram that we've been talking about so far with the so-called philosopher's stone, it would be this. It'd be the circle, of which everything else is kind of a division of, you could say. So, first of all, let's start with the idea that we'll draw our cross here again above these two central characters. So again, we have Aristotle on this side and we have Plato on this side. Plato believed in a priori more than Aristotle did. And you could really make the argument that everybody in the world is really just one of these two thinkers. So there's people that believe that what is the world, everything that is in the world, is all there is. The world is in itself, the universe is part of the universe, but the world of matter is all that there is. And that would be, I'd say, sort of an Aristotelian view, even though Aristotle wasn't exclusively that. Something that he sort of denies is this a priori state, which was really a major component of what Plato talked about. So Plato talked about the idea of the realm of forms, of things in the world that were imperfect representations of what was in the realm of the ideas and the idea of, or in the realm of perfection. So there was this higher realm, bigger than the world itself. So if we go like this, gosh, it's an ugly circle. But if we go like this, there's something further up, you could say, than what is of the world. So we have our four quadrants or whatever else. So he says that we can't really, with the body's eyes or with any sense perception, really grasp this. But there is a way to recognize it, and we'll get into that in a moment here. But I just want us to kind of make this dualistic distinction here, is that this one is a very materially based kind of perspective in the world. And this one is not really, and would allude to what we're going to talk about here as being a more mind over matter perspective. So for him, for Plato and for Socrates and most people on this side, mind was above matter. And we have some times where we would say that matter has more control than anything, because really there's some people that see the world as just matter. So we'll just address this idea. Like I don't want to really try to convince you too strongly one side or the other. I'm just here to present different ideas. So we're gonna go back to this guy, and I don't know if you remember him too well, but we kind of introduced the whole square and circle concept through him, and I made it seem like that was maybe all he really contributed, but there was a lot more. His biggest thing was this concept of quality. So his a priori was the quality principle. And he said that both the circle and the squares really were really just aiming towards that. This one is more of reaffirming the quality principle, and this one is leading towards the quality principle. And that's maybe a little bit much of a step, but I'll explain why I believe that in a moment. So what Socrates and Plato called it, the guy on the left of the last picture, where they called it the good. So again, some people say the etymology of this word is just remove the O. So this is like the godly nature. And for him, it was a very secular thing, though. He really didn't have any spiritualism or any God in his situation. He kind of vaguely alluded to it, but you could tell he really didn't want to bring that idea into it too much. But the quality was the organizing principle behind everything. So if he's talking about riding his motorcycle across the United States, he'd say that it was about the journey, and it was about the quality of the journey. Uh, I think Steve Jobs had this saying that the journey is the reward, and for him, the progression of a quality environment or a quality experience is what this is all about. So him going across the country with his son was really about that. So to add a tragic element to what we're talking about, and to kind of give a better idea of what we're talking about in a grander scheme, he actually lost his son. So this was, I call it a novel, but it really was a mostly historical kind of account of his own life, an autobiography. And one of the epilogue on his first book talked about his son being murdered, and he was stabbed, and I can't remember which city it was, but he was stabbed and he died, and while he was like 21, 22. And there was this very touching epilogue about it, and he was talking about where did he go, and that was kind of his question: where did he go? And he kind of alluded this to, well, did he? So his son was obviously cremated. He talked about, well, did he go up in the oxides of the crematory? And he was talking about how people feel such a connection with gravestones and the material evidence of the world of their existence. So he didn't really feel like that was the truth, though. So yes, he lost his son. Yes, the body was gone, but he kind of ended with talking about his daughter being born and feeling like that was the expression, and she was born after he passed away, being the expression of that unfulfilled energy of the world, or in his own psyche, of that missing piece being expressed in his daughter. So this is something we'll talk about a little bit more. I don't mean to make just too much of a spiritual appeal here, but that was his position, and he was a very like I say, he was very much in this world most of his life, and only believed in it. So we'll leave it there for now. But if we talk about William Butler Yeats, his quote I think is really helpful in this situation. So he says, "A symbol is indeed the only possible expression of some invisible existence, a transparent lamp about a spiritual flame." So to Robert, the symbol of his son was a representation of the world, of this spiritual flame that existed. And this is interesting, to say the least, but this is also about why we're using, of course, the square and the circle shape here, and the triangles as well, because these are principles that we can only show them in perfect sort of symbolic nature, because there's nothing that can really prove them concretely in the world. So we can only see evidence of it kind of indirectly, and sort of make associations based upon that. And but some of it's going to rely on some patience with taking in information in order to have it all make sense. But there's no, as we were saying with his son, with him passing away, there's no material accountability. So he can't prove what he just said about his son passing away and coming back in the spirit, kind of the spirit of his daughter that was born shortly afterwards. But maybe we shouldn't be asking for material accountability. I think about Gandhi's statement that all religions are true. And what he's kind of getting across there, I think, is that we talk, you hear the argument out there about, well, if you believe in this entity, this religious entity, why don't you believe in this religious entity? But really they're expressions of the same principle in different material means. And if we want to take an example of this, it's not too hard to do. So let's take the example of the Northwest Coast traditional cultures around the Haida. So this is in sort of northern BC, north of British Columbia, which is kind of, I don't know, very northernly in Canada, and it's coastal people. So it's a really interesting culture, because you kind of have this meld of materialism and of a very spiritual culture, and kind of this transition phase almost. And don't think of transition as one's better than the other. This is merely a transition, so from a culture that is one thing to a culture that is a little bit changing as far as how it represents itself. So if we take their example of sort of square entity, I know I kind of got this backwards here, but if we take uh, their sort of square side was represented by the eagle's spirit, and then they sort of had this yin yang relationship between the eagle spirit and the raven spirit. So different groups represented either side, and both of them were kind of expressions of these sort of principles. But I don't want you to think that I'm saying they're exactly the same as any of the other situations were. They're sort of melding different aspects together. But it's interesting that it's always birds, usually in this situation. And I think that's for the reason of the triangle sort of concepts we've talked about so far. You're always looking up. Uh, the material elements of their culture would be things like the totem pole. And in the totem pole, you see kind of the essence of what their spiritual beliefs are, because usually there's one of these two birds that are usually on or near the top, and they saw people as not being necessarily just people, that everything that was in their sort of cultural sphere and around them and what they were hunting and what they were bringing into their culture was all expressions of spirit, but with different clothes on. So they'd literally have some of these masks. So say this was a mask somebody was wearing in a festival, where it would open up and you could see a human inside. And a lot of time when they were expressing spiritual elements, they'd be expressing them with these human masks, rather than the sort of the animal elements would be really kind of expressed in surviving, in day-to-day surviving in nature. But everything could be fluidly transported through material means, like a bird body or a fish body could be something that a spirit could go in between at will. They had talked about villages on the bottom of the ocean for the salmon people, and how people would go from salmon spirit to human spirit, and how that was a very important person to their culture and taught them important things and everything else. This is one of the most interesting cultures I think I've ever had experience with, because you really, like I say, see both sides of it. A lot of people talk about when they came to the Americas, they're like, oh, they didn't have any material things to show off about it. They didn't have gold or anything else. And with this one, you actually had elements that were uh, materialistic, I guess you could say, especially towards the end of their sort of more independent cultural times, where they had lots of coppers that they used to wear. So copper was a very highly regarded element, and then it was hierarchies in their society and stuff like that. And I feel like there's a lot that can be said about that. And I'm probably ranting a little bit here, but just know for now that this really demonstrates what we're talking about, this fluidity of spirit in material elements. This is something that the Mayans used to characterize this, is that they thought this was undivided mind, sort of, before the world became. This is this sort of dual nature of something that was before, and they call this butterfly disc. And it's not settled as far as what it actually means, but that seems to be the most predominant belief, that this sort of represents the condition, the precondition before the world became. And the world is just expressions of sort of this principle extrapolated more and more and more. So, as a good example of this and how we don't see the world as they used to see, is we talk about the Dark Ages. And really, the Dark Ages, I'm going to say, is really the Dark Ages for materialism. Because there wasn't really much materially other than the big churches that we see now. Then obviously people like those, but what isn't shown is what people would have had more of at that time, which was spiritualness, or spiritual acuity. They would be able to understand what they had on a spiritual level, because this was such a religious society in Europe at this time. So they'd be more willing to adapt that. And I think it's really interesting that we look at a lot of these socialist cultures now that are really going the way of Ivan. If we go back to our analogy with the brothers Karamazov, is that they have all their worldly needs met, all of them met, and yet they have some of the high, like really high rates of antidepressants used in their cultures, and really high rates of depression in itself, and suicide rates even as well, with at least some of them anyway. And maybe it's maybe because of this, maybe we're missing something when we're just trying to feed ourselves in the world. Like he was saying with the story of the Grand Inquisitor, that maybe people just think they want that now. Maybe people just think they want bread and to have rules and order rather than anything else. And maybe the fact that the Grand Inquisitor told Jesus to leave and the people had seemingly no problem with it is because we're not looking for anything beyond the world anymore. And I'm not saying this is necessarily a strictly religious thing. I don't want to make any substantive position. I just want us to think about these ideas because I think it's important to. Postmodern talks about this quite a bit too, but postmodern does it without the sort of concept, the grand organizing concept. But I think of the term used by, what's his name now? Was it Heraclitus? I think it was Heraclitus. Heraclitus says you never step in the same river once. Everything is change in the world. The whole world is changing constantly. So you can't really base anything on that. You can't really know anything concretely forever because everything's always changing. And I think this is true on the world for sure. Everything is always changing, and that's one of the reasons that people look to the heavens, is because the stars were fixed more or less. Like, I mean, they of course spun around as the world spun around. I don't know if that's how they would have perceived it back then, but obviously they could do calendars for years on end and be very successful with it. So they had a basic understanding of that. But that's one of the reasons. I mean, even if you wanted to take a sort of just pragmatic view of it, they obviously could use it for that reason. But how are you going to make a scientific world where you're basing it on deduction? So this is always like this, B is always like that. Sorry, I should say it differently. A is always like this, B is always like that, therefore C is always like this. You can't really do that if everything's always changing, right? And I think that's a valid point. And I think that kind of gets missed a lot when we're talking about postmodern ideas. But I think that but if there's an organizing principle, that's not really necessarily true. But if the world is just material, then it is true because everything's always changing. You can say something that's true most of the time, but you never know when one of those variables, minute as it may be, maybe changes right at that very instant. So you can't make a deductive argument based on that anymore because it's changed. There's nothing in the world that doesn't move and change. So the square world is constructed post hoc, meaning we look at the world, and you can think of this as like somebody that was really successful at sports, and they'll try to understand why they were so successful, but most of the time they don't understand as they're going forward. I mean, we have people kind of giving people practice routines and everything else, but I don't think that was the main reason why they were successful. You could have everybody with the best training in the world, and there's only a few people that are going to be the best of the best just because it's more of a mind thing more than matter. And you listen to a lot of the great athletes throughout time, and they'll tell you that, especially when they look back at it, because it kind of just goes along. And I sort of think of the scientific process as sort of this lumbering machine moving really slowly, trying to make these squares of the world, making this flat world that makes sense, that we can kind of actually do deduction with, looking back and saying, okay, A is equals A, B equals B, therefore C is make like this. But there's always those principles of those two sides. Remember, we were talking about phi before. I'll go back to it in a second here. But this person on top of the elephant just knows what he wants at that moment. So he wants to make sense of, have a flat world, maybe for what he wants to make it easier and safer, but maybe he's losing something in that process too, because he's losing a connection with maybe something beyond. So we'll leave it at that for now, but Okay, so let's think of this like this. Um, we have the one side trying to make sense of the world, which is sort of the square element. But I think it's fair to say that this element also has the influence, the sort of circular one. We've been told that the whole world is nothing but entropy, just things getting more and more chaotic. But I don't know if that will always be the position we hold, and I know it's probably the material evidence of that isn't quite exactly there as far as what you can support with general tactile feel, but I'm going to give you proof. I think, or not. Well, let's just say I'll give you evidence for another position being maybe true. So we can hear Robert, our guy that did Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, the guy that lost his son. What he would say the sort of same thing. So he'd say traditional scientific method has always been at the very best, 2020 hindsight. So you can just look back at it and see that it makes sense as you go. It's good for where you have been. It's good for testing the truth of what you think you know, but it can never tell you where you ought to go. And I think that's very true. I remember listening to, I imagine a lot of people have listened to this as well, the Steve Jobs talk at university that was quite famous there. And he was talking about you'll never really understand where you're going. You just kind of do it in the right spirit. And this gets back to the same thing he was talking, or that Robert was talking about driving to experience things. You won't really understand it as you go, but as you look back, you'll understand how it all fits together if you're on that sort of path, and you'll see sort of causality in the situation. But it's only because I think he was on that path. Jobs is, and I know Jobs has taken a lot of heat through by a lot of people nowadays, but I think that's not surprising, given that he was such a counter thinker of what the world is like today. He's going against this scientific modality of everything being just random chaos. Nietzsche was another one too that talked about this a lot, and that everybody just looks at the world post hoc, like we were saying before, and just tries to have it make sense, but they really don't understand what's happening. They just want to pretend like they want to have control of it. They want to think that they understand it all, but it's just too dynamic. There's too many things happening. Like I say, especially in the world, you never step in the same river twice, because it's always changing. Everything's always changing. The rock that you just stepped on is moving, and you're changing as well. So it's just not possible. It also reminds me of that other quote we gave from Einstein, where he said, "The supreme task of the physicists is to arrive at universal elementary laws from which everything can be built up on pure deduction." And like I say, I believe that's not true. But this is the part I want to use more, is there's no logical path to these laws. Only intuition, resting on sympathetic understanding and experience, can reach them. So what we're saying, this principle is on usually the circular side, the intuition side. And then the square side is something that you sort of look at downwardly. You look at it, looking back at it and making sense of what's going on. And this is that sort of passive mentality you have to have. So I would say that, and this I shouldn't have put this as strong a terms, but deduction based on matter is impossible. But deduction based on ideas, or deduction based on a priori or the good, is possible if we understand it well enough. So what Plato used to do was do it through math and science, because you didn't really need that. You could do that all abstractly. You could do it all in your mind. You didn't need anything material to prove it. You could do it as a mind position. So if a priori quality, the good, exists, what is it like? So if we take their position, I know this is a big step for people to kind of even entertain the idea, but we'll get some of these principles of what it would be like if what they're saying is true. So quality for Robert, the good for, I always give trouble saying it, Plato, and it would be something perfect. So as an idea, it can be perfect. And this is not a priori too, sorry. And it would be changeless. as set in contrary to the world. The world is always, the changelessness is always the thing that is causing destruction of these perfect principles if we try to create it here. And that would mean that it's mind rather than matter. So mind above matter in this situation. So you can have a perfect idea, but as once you try to translate it into a perfect material object, you're not going to have it. So this is going to be hard for people to really glom onto. But it explains far more than the other way around, I'll tell you that much. I'm going to end because I have sort of that raven spirit myself. I didn't really mention this too much, but like the raven spirit, which was the Haida thing, had sort of this playful spirit. And I'm going to give you a quote now that I found horribly, horribly offensive when I first heard it. But I sort of have that personality that I want to induce people to react. We'll call it that. So this is a Robert Pirsig quote, and it will probably give you quite a strong reaction because I know it did it for me. But you know, there's something to that too. The things that give you the strong reactions and the things that really bother you, I found a lot of times they're actually true. But this is a statement he gave. So religion isn't invented by man. Man is invented by religion. What an unbelievable statement to say in this day and time. And I understand that it would be, you're probably going to have a reaction to hearing that. But just all you have to do at this point is just kind of let it settle. That's all. Just let it settle. Just let it be an idea that you're willing to entertain. That's all that's really required. So now that I've offended everybody, now that I've got everybody's hackles up, if you could say that, I wish you guys a good day, and we'll talk about more of this stuff soon. Okay, talk to you later. Bye.